Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. So I thought I'd just show a few pictures about what the book's about, really. So it came out just before lockdown started, and the first edition is on the right, and then the paperback was just after lockdown finished. So it was a strange time. So I think I guess we constantly hear about how multicultural Britain is, and how migration has shaped Britain. But I think London has some completely, not just uniquely British aspects, but completely uniquely global aspects. And one of the unique global aspects is, foundation, not just foundation by the Romans. There was nothing here before the Romans, but also the fact that there's been a constant flow of different migrant groups since the Romans. And from that point of view, that's uniquely London, I would say. And then there's all sorts of other unique aspects. So this is a picture which actually you can find anywhere on the internet, but I mean, it's quite interesting. And I guess one of the issues with London is that probably anyone can live next to anybody from the point of view of ethnicity, and I don't think I've ever lived in a. I mean, that was my experience as a child. So, when I looked out of my bedroom window, the couple opposite me was a white British man married to a woman who wore a sari. And next to them was a West Indian family. Next to them was a Greek Cypriot family. Further down, 3 doors down on our side of the road, there was a mixed heritage West Indian and white family. And next to them was an Indian Caribbean family. So, I think that's what London evolved into, and that's certainly what it seems to be today. So the other unique aspect about London, so the sort of discourse we're getting today about immigrants and as troublemakers, or immigrants as poor is the other thing. Again, uniquely London, is that I think we should think beyond the idea that immigrants in London just come in at the bottom of the social scale and do the work that everybody else doesn't want to do. I mean, that certainly does happen. But if you looked at the history of London, from the end of the 18th century, European Jewish elites, not just Jewish, but all sorts of elites, are incredibly important for the evolution of the city of London. And in the 19th century, there's a very important Greek elite community, which I'll come back to later. And the picture with all the shops, of course, is that if you go and buy anything, probably anywhere in London, you're probably not going to be served by a white British person, because entrepreneurialism is quite fundamental to the migrant experience in London, and has been since the end of the 19th century. And I did lots of work on Germans in London and some on Jews in London. So I guess the attractions of I don't know if people who live in London appreciate this. I mean, London's probably been the most important city in the world over the last 2 centuries. It may not be quite as important today as it was, 70, 80, 100 years ago. But I mean, that's one of the attractions of London, and that's why, it's attracted so many migrants. Sorry, one other thing I should have said is that when we're talking about migration into London and into Britain, most migrant groups probably count 50% of their population within London. So in the case of my community, Greek Cypriots, it's overwhelmingly London-based. Jewish Britain is not just Jewish London, but London's very important. If you're talking about Caribbean migration, London's a very Jewish city. It's a very Cypriot city. It's a very Irish city. It's a very Caribbean city, and increasingly a very African city. Well over 50% of Indians in Britain live in London as well. So that's how. That's again really important from a London and British point of view. And I think one of the key signifiers of identity has been religion, going back probably to the Huguenots, who I touch a little bit on in the book. And, I mean, what are these places? So that's St. George's, Little Alley Street on your left. That's a German church. Top right is a Greek Orthodox cathedral founded by Greek merchants in the 1870s. And bottom right, as you look at it, is the Regent's Park Mosque. So, the diversity of religion is phenomenal as well. And, if you were to study the Jewish community or any other, or the Muslim community, it would just break down into, little splinters. So, the diversity is just so diverse, for want of a better phrase. Okay, so one of my chapters is called Racists, Friends and Lovers. So I think the way you need to understand London is that racism exists next door to friendship and intermarriage. And if you don't, a lot of discourse just puts it into one or the other. So in the top left is an anti-German riot in Crisp Street. I don't know how far that is from here. You could probably walk 10, 15 minutes.
A little bit, probably about 20 minutes. Longer, yeah, it's right. Not far. Yeah. We've got an idea store at Crisp Street. Yeah.
Oh, have you? And that's 1915. The picture on the left is my school, but I'm not in that picture. And I found it on a Facebook group. So I think I was in that class in 1970. But, the reason I think I buy into multiculturalism is, so completely is because that was what my primary school class looked like. So, there was all sorts of different groups. I mean, in terms of Cypriots, they arrived at a similar time actually to West Indians. So, there's a lot of connections, and then South Asians come a bit later. But of course, my argument is that it all goes back to the Romans and the 18th, 19th century as well. So then I've got a chapter called Racists, Revolutionaries and Representatives. So there's the racists in the top left, who were probably active quite close to here in the 1970s. I hope you all know that Karl Marx spent most of his life in London and was buried in Highgate Cemetery. And I did want to put Suella Braverman there, but the reason I didn't is she is a Londoner, and that's really important. I mean, she's the same as me. She's a second generation Londoner. I mean, she's from a higher social background than me. But she is a second generation Londoner of migrant origins like myself. And the reason I put Sadiq Khan up there is because he's a Londoner who's represented a London constituency, whereas Suella Braverman represents somewhere on the south coast, if I remember correctly. Okay. So migrants have been especially important in the food business. So, I mean, I've written a separate book about the history of fish and chips, showing that it's Jewish in origin. That's the first Greek restaurant in London in the interwar years in Charlotte Street, and the Ritz was founded by a Swiss immigrant who also employed, the vast majority of his staff are always Europeans. Okay, so then I did I had a chapter called Fighters and Footballers. So we know, about people like Frank Bruno, but these, you have the predecessors of Frank Bruno go back to the late 18th century, and this is Daniel Mendoza, who was the British champion, and one of my colleagues is actually writing a book about boxers and race in Britain, which is promises to be really interesting. And then I had footballers, so I just go, I think this is the last slide, so I'll just go, no, I've got some for musicians, yeah. So I'll just go through these footballers. So, migration into football didn't start with the Premier League. Liam Brady, football, London, Tottenham and Arsenal were really Irish before the Premier League. Then you have Clyde Bess, who I remember from my childhood, and I think he changed everything. I mean, there's so much focus on, you know, the few black players at the beginning of the 20th century, but I think Clyde Best was the one we saw on our TV screens first. And then Ian Wright is my age, and he's a representative of football for African Caribbeans is a form of social mobility, I think, and now it's increasingly African. And then when you have people like Kai Havertz, he has absolutely nothing to do with Liam Brady. He's an elite. He's got more in common with Nathan Mayer Rothschild than he has with Liam Brady. And that's what, you know, these global elite footballers all have in common. And then, you know, I've got a chapter on musicians. So in the 19th century, London was full of Italian musicians who received a lot of hostility. And then you had the real elites, Handel, Sir Michael Costa, who conducted the Crystal Palace Orchestra, Jenny Lind, who was one of the most famous sopranos of the 19th century, and Otto Goldschmidt, who was a conductor, her husband. And then the final slide is Tiny Temper and Dizzy Rascal, who developed this music. They're of African origin, and you know that's London as a cultural centre evolving as a result of migration is also something we need to bear in mind.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Thank you. So as soon as I knew that the book was going to be at Writeidea, I jumped at the opportunity to chair this event because I'm a second generation Londoner myself, and I think our experiences can be quite different in the city. And I think that one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you is about that. So obviously, I think one of the big draws for me of the book is that it's not just a story about migration in London from a very academic sort of observer's point of view. It's from a lived point of view too. And do you think that did you think that changed how you approached writing the book?
Well, I mean, I had wanted to write the book for a very long time, and the publisher actually approached me to write a book. I think she wanted me to write this book anyway. But I mean, I think the way I write is, not top-down political history. It's a lived experience. I mean, I think I try to bring that through. I mean, one of the things the publisher told me to do, and I'm glad I took on what she said, was use lots of memoirs and actually biographies, autobiographies. So I tried to write the book through, the personal experiences of the migrants themselves. Whether it's I was going to say Ian Wright. Ian Wright's had, I don't know how much he wrote of them, at least 2 biographies. But I mean, his personal experiences is fascinating as a story of an African Caribbean in London, for which, I mean, he sort of says that football saved him. And, it was quite a tough path, unlike, some elite footballers who come through today.
Yeah.
But that's just one story of many. I mean, I read stuff about Nathan Mayer Rothschild, who comes in at the end of the 18th century. His experience is completely different. I mean, it's a bit more difficult to find personal experiences of people who open small businesses, but I don't know how familiar people are with Henry Mayhew as this, I mean, he's absolutely brilliant for everything, but he actually interviews Irish street sellers in the 1850s, or fried fish sellers, or Jewish stallholders in the 1850s. So I'm glad that came through. Actually,
I think it makes it more accessible too, as a way of learning about London's history. Because certainly I found it relatable. My dad used to tell me about some of the sort of racism he experienced when he first came and set up in Limehouse, and so I think it definitely did. There's so much that you could write about. There's so much content, and as you say, you talk about immigration to London from hundreds of years ago, all the way back to you even touch on like first settlers in London. How did you condense all that? How did you decide, that's that's going to be super relevant, or I won't put that in, because you could have probably written volumes and volumes.
Yeah. I think I didn't want to write a chronological study.
No.
And I think the reason I didn't want to do that was, well, partly because it will get really repetitive. Otherwise you'll just carry you just cover the same themes over and over again. I think these were the themes that I wanted to do. So I knew I wanted to do footballers, and then I felt I had to do fighters, and I knew I wanted to do music because, elites of, are really important in all these, the four great London classical orchestras were all probably German migrants are really important for those. And, like what I said in my little presentation here, if you go and buy anything in a shop in London, that would be a miracle if you're served by a white British person. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but it's extremely unlikely, and that's probably been the case for decades. And these little businesses sort of partly serve other members of the same community, but they also serve the thing. I wanted to tell this little story. Just before I came here, I went into a fish and chip shop over there, and so I was served by the owner's Turkish, and within 10 minutes you had a black person. I'm not sure if he was African or West Indian or what generation he was, Bangladeshis and so on. And that's the diversity of London, and you can't get that in. I mean, I live in Leicester. Leicester's not the same as London. I think it's probably the second most diverse city in Britain, but Leicester is not London for all sorts of reasons, and I think the level of diversity is one of the reasons.
Yeah. You talk about that the risk of it becoming repetitive, and that's interesting because sort of from the earliest migrants, some of the challenges that you've talked about, and some of the way that the country responds to immigration in many ways hasn't really changed or progressed. And is that something you continue to observe?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what the function of migrants is for public opinion or the newspapers, but maybe I guess I came across in part in the Brexit debate. It's a deflection, isn't it, from real issues by focusing on migrants, and you can blame everything on migrants. But I mean, in one of the other books I wrote about migration to Britain generally, what tends to happen is that a different group attracts attention at one moment, so you can trace it back to the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was the Irish, then it was Jews, then it was Germans in World War I, then it was Jews again, and then after the Second World War, it's African Caribbeans, then it becomes Asians, then it becomes refugees, then it becomes Muslims, then it becomes Europeans as a result of EU migration, and currently it's Albanians. So I don't know how long that one will last, but then it will move on to then I guess the Daily Mail or whoever will get bored of it, and then we'll move on to the next group. And I guess one of the key things I wanted to do in this book was just to demonstrate how, if you're talking about a Londoner, you're talking about people like me and you, or you or whoever. I mean, that's sort of the people I just saw in the chip shop. That's what a Londoner is, and I don't know who these people. And when you have people like Suella Braverman, I mean, that's really complicated, isn't it? Why does a second generation migrant hate migrants so much? I don't know what's going on there, and it's really difficult to understand. And a lot of the senior Tory hierarchy are now second generation migrants, and I haven't worked that out for myself. I mean, I just think it's a rapid way to integration if you do that. But somehow there's something very wrong with that.
And I was going to ask you about that, the whole narrative that we're seeing at the moment, and it's always been in the press, but it is now being amplified by the most powerful people sort of against the most powerless. And what do you think the impact of that will be on future migrants coming to find life in the UK and in London? Do you think that will?
Well, I mean, that discourse has been there all the time. If you go back to, so a lot of research has been done on the Jewish arrivals before the First World War. I mean, and actually that is quite similar to what's happening now, because a lot of the hostility came from established Anglo Jewry, although, they are a bit different from people like Suella Braverman because they're fifth generation. But, that didn't stop, Jewish migration. And of course, Jewish migration is, I taught a course for one of my colleagues on Jews in 20th century Britain. I mean, that is very much a success story because of the social mobility. And, the Jewish migration begins in the East End and then it moves outwards to the suburbs. And, the hostility towards them was really vehement, exactly the same as what we're getting now. I suppose what's disturbing about what happened last week was that a cabinet minister's making such, and that doesn't tend to happen. I mean, the other example is Enoch Powell, who was expelled. So that's that. I mean, as a historian, I don't often see new departures in stuff, but maybe that one's a bit scary.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think anti-immigrant discourse doesn't stop migration.
No.
And probably, never will, because it's just a constant of British history and, London history, I think.
You can't have London without
London
history without that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I suppose, I didn't give many statistics, but I guess, we had that census release on Thursday saying 1 in 6 people in Britain, but we weren't given the London figure. I think the London figure is probably, if not more than 1 in 2, close to 1 in 2 Londoners are born abroad.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, yeah. So again, that's why London's different.
Yeah, and you talk about London being such an important place and such an important place for migrants. Do you think London will always continue to be a beacon?
I think so. Yeah. I guess it depends on immigration control, because I guess what this government is. Once you have, if we don't have free movement of labour, so then you control migration, which I think is what this government. The sensible members of this government aren't opposed to migration. They just want what they see as the right kind of migration, i.e. economically useful.
Yeah.
So, no, it will continue.
Yeah. I think, just the last thing from me, and we'll open it out, I think that all of that discourse, actually, the book is a really nice antidote to that one.
Yeah.
Because it celebrates what makes London such an amazing place. And so what do you think is the best thing for you about being a Londoner and our city?
Well, God, I almost got a bit emotional there. I don't know, I just can't put that into words.
Yeah.
Whenever we go abroad with my wife, then when they ask me where we're from, we say London.
Yeah.
Because, London is different, and that's that,
Yeah.
None of our families have ever lived outside London. Just when I walked outside of this tube station, I just felt almost really liberated.
Yeah.
I don't visit the East End very often, but it's such a, quite a unique place because of that history and, even the smell of it. It's just wonderful. I
do exactly the same thing. I say I'm a Londoner before I say I'm British or I'm English or anything else. I always say I'm a Londoner first. Definitely. Oh, thank you so much. I love this so much, and it's been so lovely. I feel really that I've had the chance to ask my questions, but we will obviously be very welcome. And I think, do we have a microphone? No, for this one? Okay. If I could ask, if you do ask questions, if you could speak as loudly as possible, because we have some amazing people sitting in a room somewhere else in London listening to us and typing it all up for stage text, which is quite amazing. So yes, and then I've got you as well, yeah.
Thank you for that, really enlightening. London is a really vibrant city, and it is vibrant because it has welcomed over the centuries so many people from across the world, and we actually chose to live here in Bethnal Green because of that. But I wonder whether, with you alluded to the issues of people travelling to London, risking their lives from Albania, etc. It's come to a place where now you've got Albania actually desecrated of its upcoming generation because they all want to come to the bright lights of London and the UK. And how do we actually deal with that? Because it's not a good situation for Albania. The country is now going to regress because its brightest people are leaving, and we probably, in a way, can't take full advantage. So I sort of see a dichotomy there of us really welcoming people, but then the home country suffers.
Maybe. I mean, I'm not sure in that. I mean, I guess the better examples would be when we take doctors from, poor countries. I mean, I mean, if you're taking elites, people which poorer countries have trained, then I don't have the answer to that. But I mean, I see where you're coming from. I mean, somewhere like Albania would probably. I mean, I don't think, somewhere like Albania would probably be somewhere like Cyprus, where you do have a significant, off the top of my head, 5 or 10% of the population of Cyprus would have migrated to Britain in the 1950s, but that certainly hasn't had any long-term impact. So I think the answer to your question is it probably depends on whether you cream off the elites, which so if you're importing Indian doctors, then they've been paid for.
They don't have a young generation in Albania. They're complaining about that. So it means that the older people that are left behind now have really no way of making a living because there's no customers, there's no people.
Well, that would have happened in Cyprus in the 50s, and it probably would have happened in Jamaica or in the same period. So if you just have a very small percentage of the population migrating, then I don't think it has an impact. I think it depends on who migrates, to be honest.
Now I've got you, then this lady, and then you. That's fine.
I just wanted to say two things, but to ask a question, I don't have a television studio. Who's that lady you were mentioning that was disrespectful to
Oh, the home secretary.
But she's from an immigrant family.
Yeah.
Disrespectful, isn't it? Don't forget where they all come from.
Here.
You mentioned about, all the intelligentsia having to leave country. I'm a nurse, hate to give the age away, but I trained at the Whitechapel, even when Bethnal was open. And all the nurses I've met from countries, sometimes they've had to come, they've been invited to come, of all nationalities. And I want to say, for me, when I was born here, they are brilliant. And I say that's thank you to the positivity of the immigration, not the negativity. That's why I wanted to really put that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think books like this are so important, given the current narrative from the government, Suella Braverman and Priti Patel is another sort of example of what you're talking about. I teach in a primary school in central London, which is exactly the way you describe it. It's Albanian children, it's Italian children, it's Chinese children, it's Bangladeshi children, and that's what makes it fabulous. But you almost fear for those children's future if this anti-immigrant sort of discourse carries on. And I think a lot of immigrant populations do send money back. I don't think it's just a drain one way. I think it's much more reciprocal than that. But I just wanted to make a point and ask a question. The point is there's a blue plaque to Daniel Mendoza just
Okay. I'll go and see that.
If you go back to the tube, it's just up there. And the question is just how gentrification and class impacts because this area in East London was the Huguenots, it was the Bangladeshis, it was Jewish people. The Eastern European people couldn't afford really to live in Spitalfields or where I'm, down Bethnal Green now, because gentrification impacts too, doesn't it, on the class, on those patterns of immigration.
Yeah, I think that's I say this in the conclusion. I always give the example of, I have to mention my father, because he came you know, he really did come as a penniless immigrant in 1958 and lived above a pub in Aldgate for 6 months, which he keeps telling me about. Well, he told me again when I told him I was coming to speak at Bethnal Green, and worked in Lyons, Lyons Corner House, for those of you who remember them, in Tottenham Court Road. And he experienced social mobility because my mother was a seamstress, and on that salary, they managed to buy a house in Crouch End. Which, if a pastry cook marries a seamstress today, there's absolutely no way they can. So that's one really significant change, and you know, in the conclusion, I mean, maybe I don't know if people like that will ever be able to afford I don't know who can afford a house in London anymore, but you know, that's, you know, my parents' experience is in the past from that point of view. I guess one other thing I would say, however, is probably a lot of London property is owned by people of migrant origin, and they probably arrived at the right time. So somehow, if you arrived in London from the late 19th century to the 1960s, then you know, because from the 40s to the 80s, London was losing population. I mean, you know, I think this is partly an issue of supply and demand, isn't it? And you know, London's population is at the highest it's ever been, and is increasing even further. So I mean, I think that's a key factor as well.
And I think where I live now in outer London, we have got a growing Eastern European community, which is interesting because the sort of the people that are there are not as used to dealing with seeing the population change. So that's presenting some interesting challenges as well.
Yeah, I think it's a question, I'm not sure. I'll try to turn this out in my head. Thinking of the immigrant experience and integration, as you said, most immigrants come to cities, almost certainly to London, and their children almost certainly will stay. They miss doing that. They miss the rest of Britain, you know, the rural society, the coast, and all these things. There was an interesting thing, I think it was on Country File, of an Asian man trying to get Birmingham Asians to go hiking. Is there an issue in that, do you think, that integration is only within an urban area?
I mean, I'll have to give personal answers. I mean, I've been to the Lake District, and actually, if you go to the Lake District, there's lots of northwest people of Asian origins who are in the Lake District. And you know, from my own personal point of view, you know, because I went to this school and I was integrated into British values, I mean, you know, for me, it's never been an issue. My wife's from a completely different ethnic background. I mean, we don't have an issue. I mean, one other point to make is, of course, British agriculture has been fundamentally dependent on migrant labour going back to the Irish in the 19th century, if not even further back than that. So, no, I mean, I think if you're fully integrated into these cities, you appreciate. You know, somebody rang me up the other day, Pam Fox, who's writing a book about Jewish hotels in Bournemouth, which evolved after the Second World War. So no, I'm not sure how real that is actually.
Mm-hmm. A couple of questions at the back, and then I'll come over to you. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. So yeah, please go. Yeah.
I haven't read your book. I'd very much like to. You can see it. It's the first time I've heard of you, but I will certainly read your book, because you looked at the factual things that have happened, and I believe a historian. But behind all this, we have the question of prejudice and racism and things that go with that. And that's, you know, when we read about migration as a rule, that's what comes to the fore. Do you cover that in your work?
Well,
did you have a problem with political correctness when you're writing?
Not really. Not the second. The second one's easy. Not really. No.
History, and I find it can be quite a problem to actually say what is the obvious.
I think what I'm finding quite interesting nowadays is when I started teaching in universities in the early 90s, I was way ahead of the game in terms of political correctness, using your phrase. Nowadays, I sometimes have to think twice before I say some stuff, but that might be because I'm getting old. I don't know, but I know. My PhD thesis was on the German community in Britain in World War I, so that was a story of ethnic cleansing, really. And I've done a book about racial violence in Britain. Sorry.
One of the things you said was that you don't spend a lot of time in the East End. As an East End historian, I would recommend that you do, because if you, as I do very often, walk up along Mile End Park, I see people playing football, and in the football teams you get not only both genders, you've got every region really playing together, and obviously in very, very good spirit. And that strikes me as the reality of the very best of the immigration that you find here in the East End, and not the very worst that you find in the media.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like the question you asked me, the reality of London life is what you've just described, and that was the reality of my childhood, and probably if you go back to the East End in the 19th century, there's lots of memoirs from, Jewish people who grew up here and just give the story that you gave, that a lot of their friends were not Jewish. I mean, it's the reality of how London works, I think.
My father was a Jewish, Jewish immigrant, I think. He grew up in the East End, and he always used to talk to me about how welcoming this country was. That's what communist people say. Mm-hmm. I see that today, as I saw it, I've seen it all my life. This country is a tremendously welcoming country. You get the really pick up on unpleasant experiences and so on, but overwhelmingly, immigrants are welcome.
Well, I guess the way I'd put it is that they succeed despite the discourse, despite the racist discourse. I mean, like somebody like my father doesn't really talk about any experiences like that, but I mean, he just got on with it. And I think, I wrote another book called An Immigration History of Britain, and the subtitle was Multicultural Racism, because, the only way you can understand Britain is if you accept what you're saying, which goes hand in hand with the racism. You can't, that's how Britain works. The racism's there, but migrants and their descendants succeed, or experience, well, whatever, however you measure that, experience social mobility, I guess, and become integrated.
There's a line in Hamilton: as immigrants, we get the job done. And whenever I watch it, I go, yes, we do. I think I've got 3 questions lined up. I've got the gentleman that was behind, this lady, and then yourself. Do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I'm looking forward to reading this book. I'm actually 4th generation German immigrant.
Oh.
Very familiar with your work on German immigration before World War I. And as keeper of the family archives and photographs, I'm in the process of writing everything up before it gets forgotten. My family's from Birmingham, and I wondered if it was possible whether you had any sort of insight into where I would go to do some wider research on the German immigrant community in Birmingham particularly. Because I'm just coming up against a brick wall. And I spoke to Professor Carl Chin, and he said that you've really done any research on. You've done research on German immigration, but actually looking at the community that existed in Birmingham, very, very, very good work has actually been done. So I just wondered if you have any advice for me on where I might go to sort of expand my reading, or perhaps even write to you and continue this conversation by email.
Yeah, you can definitely write to me. I mean, it might be that the German community Was there a German church in Birmingham?
There's a German historian here, so German community historian here. So.
Well, I thank you for the I'm not so sure. I'm a German historian. There should be a German church in Birmingham, and they might have an archive, or they have given their papers to a Birmingham archive, because that's what we did here in London.
Okay.
Because the St George's, the picture that you showed there, is still here, it is still open, and the archives are in Tower Hamlets Archives. I don't know if anything from Birmingham went to the British Library, and the Greater London Archive, Metropolitan Archive, sorry, I'm too old. So you might find something there as well, but I'm not sure. But I think your archive in Birmingham and the German Protestant Church, is your family background Protestant or Catholic? Protestant, yeah, that is the church that is through there.
That was serendipitous, wasn't it? You can have a cuppa together outside when you go out to the room.
Can I just?
Yes. Can I just say, for those people who are interested what St George's looks like, by chance tonight at 6 o'clock there is a half-an-hour Vespers with organ music at St George's, always on the first Saturday of the month.
Thank you.
So if you want to go and see what it looks like, because it's an 18th century building, still in its 18th century form. Just 5 minutes from Aldgate, off Lehman Street, or for the EastEnders around here, Lemon Street.
Thank you.
I just wanted to come back on the Germans, because the one group which was destroyed by racism was the Germans in the, well, I mean, that's what my research was about, was the German community in the First World War. And, you know, the phrase I use now is that they're ethnically cleansed, because all their shops are destroyed, they're interned, and then over 50% of them are deported. So in 1914, there were about 60,000 Germans in Britain. At the end of the war, it's down to 20,000, and it doesn't recover until the EU free movement of labour in the 21st century. So it's, well, you know, that is quite a unique experience, but, you know, I mean, it's not something you can, well, I mean, I've never swept it under the carpet, because that's what established me as a historian, writing that story.
Yes.
I'd like to return to the subject of the Albanians. That is current, you know, in flux, it seems. So what about those who aren't professional, doctors, etc., etc.? I mean, they should be able to work if they've got skills, and I'm sure they have. So, you know, I feel there is a problem there that really could help, I'm not saying resolve it, but could help resolve something if they were allowed to work. I think this business that they are allowed to work, they have certain skills, all right, the skills that we need, that would give them an opportunity to become integrated and for us to understand where people come from and what their culture.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think that's what's always happened in London, that people have come in to do all sorts of jobs, whether, you know, a waiter or a doctor and everything in between. And, you know, London was largely built by Irish immigrants in the 19th century. So, yeah, I mean, I agree. It's just that the government is obsessed with the economic usefulness, and, you know, that's what we've evolved to.
But it's so distorted, their idea of economic usefulness is completely
Yeah.
distorted. They don't understand what it actually means, and for this country, you know, and for them.
I think we've got time for one more question.
I was just thinking also many members of the cabinet, their family came to the UK without the need of as far as I'm aware, without like the current visa system that we do have now. Yeah, but that's another conversation. I was wondering, what about growing up in London during the war in Cyprus? How did that affect your family's relations with Turkish Cypriots that they would have met if they did? I mean, we talked about sort of anti-immigration sentiment, but what about tensions within migrant communities, and if the politics from back home ever like created tensions between the Cypriot community here.
Actually, I'll come back to your first point, if I may, because a lot of these cabinet ministers come from elite backgrounds, and that's why. No, I think they do. If you look at
Patel's parents, or Suella Braverman.
Suella Braverman,
The nurse, Suella's.
But her father wasn't.
Well,
and Rishi Sunak, his mother was a pharmacist and his father was a doctor. So they were professional people.
Yeah, they're professionals.
I'm not sure.
they were kicked out of Africa, of course, racism, because of racism.
And Priti Patel's parents were Ugandan Asians, so they were kicked out.
Yeah.
But they. Okay. Okay. But I think they're. Okay. But I mean, they're from a higher social background than Kemi Badroch I would think is an elite as well. So the answer to your question is it depends what you look at. So in my school, Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots were one group. I mean, my father worked with other Turkish Cypriots. When Turkey invaded Cyprus in 1974, we stopped going to Turkish restaurants. I mean, in the longer term, I think you move on from that as a London Cypriot. So it depends, I think.
I mean, after the separation on the island, after the island was divided and back in Cyprus, where you could no longer go to the north or the south, did any of that kind of tension which existed post-separation manifest itself within the Cypriot community here, or did the fact that the migrant experience kind of papered over some of those practices?
Well, I mean, I'm not. I mean, I think they're different communities, so they evolved separately anyway. So I don't think it intensified any differences that already existed. I mean, it may have done for a very short period of time, but not over the longer term. And I mean, in a sense, you probably wouldn't have. I mean, one of the key indicators of integration is who you marry, and I mean, there's little intermarriage between Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. However, it does take place, and I know people who have married Turkish Cypriots, sometimes causing much hostility, but nevertheless, it went ahead.
I think we just got Victor. Will be our last question. Thank you.
Yeah, just some thoughts, really. Just wondering what you thought of my thoughts. What was the question? Yeah, you mentioned earlier that when you think of who is a Londoner, it's the people you meet in the chip shop. I thought, I've never been there, but I've heard about a lot of Londoners migrating to places like Spain. Now, in places like Spain, you walk down there and there'll be a fish and chip shop. So I'm like, okay, so is the spirit of London like a transferable thing to like another place? And we sort of live in like a global village, really, don't we? Where if you're a guy on your living room, you're watching stuff, American shows on Chinese TV with an Indian takeaway on Swedish furniture. Kind of we sort of live in a global village in many ways. Yeah, that's my thought.
Well, again, if you go back to your original question, I mean, who's a Londoner? You also have lots of West Indians who came here for a short period of time and then went back to Jamaica, for example. You have Cypriots who actually, some Cypriots have run fish and chip shops in London or elsewhere and then gone back to Cyprus. And I mean, I don't know if you take the spirit of London with you, maybe in your mind. I mean, I live in Leicester. I still see myself as a Londoner, and the reason I see myself as a Londoner is because Londoners, well, it's incomparable. Yeah. It's a global, unique city, not just from the point of view of the multicultural stuff. It's like you know, everything's here. And, you know, I constantly come back to London since the 30 years I've moved out of here, out of London.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's been really interesting. And thank you for everyone taking part. It's been really good.